Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the webinar on the refugee issue in Thailand. Today, it is the third time. If you remember, we have already two times. The first one is about the refugee in Thailand in general. For example, the situation and the protected challenge. And last week, if you still remember, it is the national screening mechanism. And this time, we will talk about the refugees living in the camp along Myanmar border. And this camp is already existing for more than 30 years. Today, with us, we have 7 panelists. With us here in the studio, we have 3. The first one, we are really happy to introduce you. Yes, Mr. Themba Lewis. He is the Secretary General at Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network. He was editor-in-chief of Rights in Exile, has taught refugee rights in Bulgaria and Egypt, provided legal representation for detained asylum seekers in the United Kingdom, and is a registered member of the Law Society of England and Wales. Welcome, Themba.
Thank you.
The next one is Sally Thompson. She is an executive director of the Border Consortium and chair of the Committee for Coordination of Services to Displaced Persons in Thailand. Sally has over 25 years experience working with the TBC and coordinating and delivering humanitarian assistance to refugees and internal displaced people as a result of the conflict in Southeast Myanmar. She was awarded as a member of British Empire in 2010 for community services to Burmese refugees in Thailand. Welcome to the panel. And you see here, the next one that in our studio, Wannasingh Prasertkul is the writer and the documentary producer. He has been unwavering in his commitment to response and awareness to help and support refugees in Thailand and around the globe. He also helped to respond for refugees in emergency situations such as the Rohingya crisis and the devastating earthquake and tsunami in Indonesia. He is very influential among the younger generation with his creative mind and positive attitude towards global issues, especially involving wars, conflicts, and refugees. We not only 3 panelists with us here, we also have other 4 panelists. They will zoom in. Just wait for a moment for our technical process, and then we will link you. Please here, Father Joseph Hampson. He is a Jesuit priest who has worked with refugees in Africa and Asia for close to 2 decades in various capacities. Since 2019, he is an education and pastoral project director working with Jesuit Refugee Service in Hampson province. Next, Komson Phayonsakdapas. He is a senior field coordinator, work with Save the Children Thailand in Masot office. Komson has vast experiences working for several international NGOs, including Humanity and Inclusion, Rights to Play, international organizations for migration, the Border Consortium, and Diakonia Thailand. Our next panelist, Nganyapor. She is a Karen woman. She was born on Thai-Myanmar border and became a refugee at the age of 11. She is a general secretary of the Karen Women Organization, an organization with over 70,000 members. She received several awards, such as the Padma Young Leader Award in 2013 the Women of Courage Award from the U.S. Department of State in 2019. She also received another award from KWO for her roles as a young leader in 2015. In 2019, she also received the recognition award from KWO for having worked with that organization for more than 20 years. Next. Next panelist is Prasertkul. He became refugee in Thailand due to civil war in Myanmar. Currently, he serves as an education and livelihood coordinator at Karen Refugee Committee. He also an executive director at Karen Peace Support Network, and he is a co-founder and country representative of Asia Pacific Network of Refugees. As we have a lot of panelists here, it is so grand to have all of you with us. So only 1.5 hours is not enough, so we asked to extend the time until 4. Please stay with us. This is very interesting. Now is the time to get to know the camp refugee and related situation. And let's start with the first panelist, Mr. Themba Lewis. So you will start with a kind of refugee in the global level.
Yes.
Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Pat. Thank you all for having me, and thank you to everyone who is watching. I intend in the next 10 minutes to give a bit of a rights-based overview of the history of refugee camps and how we find ourselves now in a situation where we have camps that have existed for many, many decades, and we continue to consider refugees as people who deserve to be in a camp or should be in a camp. So there will be some time, as I understand, for questions and answers later. But just to begin, I'll start with the fact that in 2013, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, who's now the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, declared that anyone who thinks refugee camps are a good idea has never lived in one. The sentiment contradicted more than 30 years of UNHCR practice across the globe, where the UN had worked with, often pressured and sometimes paid, state governments to establish and maintain closed and confined refugee settlements in places like Kenya, Lebanon, Jordan, Tanzania, Uganda, and here in Thailand. While refugees have been present in the world for longer than modern states have existed, the establishment of refugee camps is a relatively new phenomenon. Some of the first formal refugee camps were established by the Red Cross before the United Nations ever existed, notably and somewhat ironically, in Syria and in Palestine, to host more than 40,000 European refugees fleeing World War II. Camps make a lot of sense for authorities, but they have never made sense for refugees. Camps allow authorities to easily identify and keep track of refugees, centralize humanitarian support, and most importantly, control the population. Refugee residents, however, find themselves interned in remote and often inhospitable locations, removed from critical supports and information, and blocked from contributing to host communities. They're stripped of access to the tools and experience they bring with them, and become reliant on systems imposed upon them, often without consideration of their own needs and their own skills. One key piece of the logic behind camp establishment runs along simple lines. Refugees are a temporary phenomenon and will return to their countries soon, and camps ensure that return. History demonstrates the opposite, however, and most refugees remain in exile for decades. Many of the refugees who first inhabited camps like Dadaab in Kenya have died there, and their children have never seen the world beyond the confines of the camp. Some don't even know why their families fled in the first place. Dadaab is now Kenya's third largest city, but due to the construct of the camp, its residents cannot contribute to the Kenyan economy or add richness to the diverse Kenyan socio-cultural makeup. Dadaab is one of the most visible camps on the planet, and as a result, when most people in the world think of refugees, they think of camps. But the majority of the world's refugees do not live in camps. Many countries, like Egypt, for example, don't allow camps, and many refugees aware of what camp life is like, forego formal registration in order to live lives outside of these structures, often undocumented, unsupported, and at risk in the shadows of cities and towns around the globe. Nonetheless, in spite of the Guterres Declaration, camps remain the focus of refugee response, and Bangladesh, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia, and Jordan currently host the largest. To contextualize this discussion to our own context, Thailand has maintained refugee camps since 1979, when Khmer and Vietnamese refugees were interned along the Thai-Cambodia border. And it now hosts nearly 100,000 people living in 9 camps across 4 provinces on the border with Myanmar. There are a number of problems to consider when we think about refugee camps. Perhaps the most important from a rights perspective is that they're illegal under international law. The 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees affords a number of fundamental rights to refugees, and encampment violates a number of these. Even UNHCR, which has promoted camps for decades, stated in a 2014 policy that the defining characteristic of a camp is limitation on the rights and freedoms of refugees and their ability to make meaningful choices about their lives. The most important of these rights is the right to freedom of movement. Article 26 of the 1951 Convention provides that states shall afford refugees the right to choose their place of residence within the territory and to move freely within the state. Camps violate this right. Freedom of movement is a critically important refugee right, and nearly all others are contingent upon it. Without freedom of movement, rights to employment, education, documentation, family unity, and many others are severely curtailed, if not completely blocked. This right is repeatedly articulated in international law, reiterated in domestic interpretation, and appears in numerous national constitutions. The 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights uses the key word everyone in Article 12. Everyone lawfully within the territory of a state shall, within that territory, have the right to liberty of movement and freedom to choose their residence. The failure to uphold this right is the single most important obstacle to refugees regularizing their lives in the aftermath of flight. The fact that camps actively restrict movement may not be widely known, but the fact that encampment violates rights is no secret. The European Court of Human Rights has even gone so far as to rule that subjecting people to the conditions in Kenya's Dadaab camp amounts to a violation of Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights, the Prohibition of Torture. In 1921, Fridtjof Nansen, the first League of Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, began the most ambitious refugee program the world had ever seen, solving the challenge of over 1 million Russian refugees in Europe. Nansen believed that no solution to displacement would be found without legal recognition of the necessity to travel, whether that be return to Russia, relocation within a host country, or movement onwards. He realized early on that facilitating movement rather than restricting it capitalized on the benefits of mobile populations and mitigated the negative consequences of forced displacement. Nansen won the Nobel Prize, and the Nansen Passport, the travel document he instituted, is the first official documentation recognizing legal status as a refugee. Nearly a century later, UNHCR, the institution effectively established by Nansen, has revisited those initial ideas. 6 years ago, the organization officially pivoted away from the encampment approach, stating that UNHCR's experience had been that camps have a significant negative impact over the longer term for all concerned. Living in camps can engender dependency and weaken the ability of refugees to manage their own lives, which perpetuates the trauma of displacement and creates barriers to solution, whatever form they take. Camps can also distort local economies and development planning while also causing negative environmental impacts in the surrounding areas. In some contexts, camps may increase critical protection risks, including sexual and gender-based violence, child protection concerns, and human trafficking. Camps may not either contribute to security, where they become a venue for the forced recruitment or indoctrination of refugees. Researchers have come to this conclusion for years, but they're not the only ones. Refugees themselves have also long protested confinement. In 1987, El Salvadoran refugees staged a massive walkout in Honduras due to camp-related risks, including militarization. In 2002, asylum seekers attempted suicide in protest of detention at Australia's infamous Woomera facility. In 2014, 30,000 refugees marched in Israel to protest requirements that they reside in the Holat Center. The Kakuma News Reflector, a publication produced by refugees in Kakuma Camp, Kenya, regularly features pieces about the violation of refugee rights in the camps. It's been 69 years since the 1951 convention came into being, guaranteeing freedom of movement. So why are nearly half the world's refugees still interned in camps? The answers are often political or based in anti-refugee sentiment. Freeing states and entrenched organizational systems of camp logic will not be easy, and UNHCR's policy is only as good as its implementation and states' political will to modernize. Refugee rights advocates will need to maintain our focus on ensuring the principles UNHCR has put forward are pursued, and that we broaden our scope to the plethora of forms of refugee immobilization in existence, including detention and offshore processing. Camps are just one part. The question is how we move forward from here. The answer is by listening to refugees and host communities themselves, respecting fundamental rights, and celebrating the richness that comes from community.
Thank you so much, Themba, for your background of the camps and the rights of refugees. This is make us really aware how the rights of the refugees should be, particularly the rights of the movement and the way forward. How should we do that? Thank you so much.
Thanks, Pat.
The next speaker is Sally Thompson. She will walk us through the situation on the Thai-Myanmar camps. Yes. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pat, and thank you for inviting me to speak here today, but also for hosting the series of seminars to draw attention to the situation of refugees here in Thailand. So thank you, I'm very happy to be here. I'd like to start by just giving really an overview of the history of the camps and just to take you through briefly through to where we are today. So if I can start with the next, which is the map to put it all in a context. So currently we have around 82,000 refugees in 9 temporary shelters, which are ranging in size from about 2,000 to 31,000 people. Over 250,000 refugees have sought protection in the camps in Thailand since 1984. This is more than 35 years that the camps have been established. Most people fled from armed conflict or human rights abuses and persecution under the Burma Army. The majority are from the ethnic states of southeastern Myanmar bordering with Thailand. And in the camps now there are a range of ethnic groups. The majority are Karen, but they bring with them a mix of Buddhist, Christian and Islamic religions. Most people have been in camps for at least 10 years, and some have been in the camps for more than 30 years. Half the population now is under 19, and almost 30% were either born in the camps or in Thailand itself. Next. So the policy has been very simple. It's temporary shelter for refugees, no local integration, and repatriation as soon as possible. And it was only after 20 years that resettlement became offered as an option for refugees. But it's essentially confinement to camp. Refugees have gone through various cycles over the years, from being relatively self-reliant in small remote communities to becoming totally aid-dependent as camps were consolidated into larger communities and people were confined. Here, after the military coup in Thailand in 2014, the policy was further reinforced with restrictions on movement and confinement once again being doubly enforced. because in the border areas, the military concerns revolve around deforestation, drugs, and human trafficking, and they want to control irregular movement of people. And refugees, as has been said, they have no legal status here in Thailand. They're not allowed to work outside of the camps, and anyone outside of the camp is therefore seen as an illegal migrant. However, they do go out, they do get arrested, and they are subject to detention and deportation. So why do they go out? Oh, they want to provide for themselves, and they want to do better for their families. Assistance that they receive from the international community is very basic, and it has decreased over the years. So how to address one of these sort of key protection issues on movement? Next, please. So there have been a range of different approaches in order to minimize the need for people to leave the camps. So trying to provide job creation in the camps, livelihood opportunities for people in camp, but also to make people aware of the risks they face if they do go outside and how to minimize those risks. But protection is also about strengthening identification of vulnerable groups and building awareness in the community of people with special needs. As funding for refugees decreases, we've seen humanitarian support has shifted to focus on the most vulnerable people in the camps. But long-term confinement has taken its toll. Long periods without gainful employment have given rise to increasing social problems in camps, from domestic violence to substance abuse to youth gangs. And this is largely fueled by the sense of hopelessness for their future, lack of job opportunities, cut off from their communities in Myanmar, and for youth, both lack of employment, but also lack of further education. And therefore, with this lack of further education and job opportunities, has led to increase in early marriage. Next. So, what are the potential solutions? People are leaving the camps. We are seeing the populations decreasing. Since 2012, with the ceasefire agreements in Myanmar and the ethnic groups, and the transition to a civilian government under the National League for Democracy, discussion of return has been on the table. NGOs and community leaders have been preparing people for a future outside of the camps. So people we are seeing are returning, but it's relatively few. In the last 7 years, we've seen about 22,000 people have gone back to Myanmar, of which only 1,000 have chosen to go through the formal return process, whereby they receive assistance for that initial return, transportation, and very basic limited support to start them on their way in their future in Myanmar. But from the refugee perspective, they ask, who will guarantee their security? We see today in southeastern Myanmar, there is still ongoing conflict and militarization. There's very limited access to basic services, healthcare and education. And for those who have returned, livelihoods is a challenge. Pre-COVID-19, we saw many people coming in from southeast Myanmar, crossing daily into Thailand, seeking work. And it's estimated around 80% of households in southeast Myanmar has somebody working in Thailand to support the family back home. But given that almost 30% of refugees were born in Thailand, where is home for them? So while return is the preferred solution for refugees, the reality is that for many, they do not consider the situation is stable, and thus there is a need for multiple solutions. And this really brings us on to something core that underlines all refugee protection, and that's documentation, civil documentation. This will give refugees protection, it will give them freedom of movement, whether they choose to return or whether they choose to seek work in Thailand. But verification of citizenship is key, and the Myanmar government is the only entity that can provide that. The Thai government has proposed a U-turn whereby refugees return to Myanmar, they get documentation, citizenship, and then they could come back to Thailand as legal Myanmar citizens. However, at the moment, this process needs to be simplified, both for clarity and also for timeliness. The Thai government knows there are few jobs in Myanmar, so even if refugees do return to Myanmar, they will come back to Thailand. But without documentation, they will remain illegal, stateless, and open to exploitation. So what if the Ministry of Labour prioritised refugees as potential job seekers within the bilateral MOU between Myanmar and Thailand? The numbers are small. There's only 40,000 people of working age in the camps when there is a need for 4 million migrant workers. And in the meantime, as the borders remain closed due to COVID-19, will the Thai government consider allowing refugees to work outside the camps? They can be reskilled in the camps to match the labour shortages in certain sectors, and at the same time they can be prepared for the expectations of employers and also for considerations around occupational health and safety issues in the workplace. And digital platforms opens up opportunities now for training, for recruitment, but there are still restrictions on internet use in the camps for refugees. And finally, there is donor fatigue. There are not the mechanisms to fund protracted refugee situations, and we are competing with global crises where there are greater priorities. The camps are not sustainable, and nobody should be confined for 30 years to a camp. We must look for long-term solutions. And really underpinning this is the need for ID, for legal status. Donors, NGOs, partners, we need to focus on supporting refugees to get documentation and overcoming the barriers to access citizenship. Everyone has the right to a nationality, and no one should be left behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sally, for this really in-depth information about this. And to go back is also not a solution for them because they still worry about the security. And to be here, how? Right? Because they're still illegal here. So the stakeholder need to Okay, now we have to do a kind of small break and we will come back later. See you soon. Welcome back again. So sorry for the difficulty. So, Sally, so sorry for that. So could you please summarize what you have talked for us again?
Sure, you're welcome. After 30 years confined to refugee camps, refugees need to be allowed to work. They need to be able to contribute to themselves, to their families. They've developed a range of skill sets over the many years that they have been in camps, having responsibilities for the running of their camps and their communities. But also, it's an opportunity to build relationships, partnerships with the public-private sector, find out what skills do they need, where are the shortages, and then reskill refugees in the camps so that then they can be matched with suitable job recruitment in the Thai economy and contribute to the Thai economy. But to do that, the Thai government will also need to provide documentation, and generally refugees, in conclusion, documentation is key to their future, to give them choice, to give them freedom of movement. We need to ensure that refugees have access to civil documentation, they have a right to nationality, to gain citizenship, and to be able to be a part of the society at large and not confined to a refugee camp for another 30 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kusali, for your deep knowledge on that. So we cannot, in Thailand, we cannot move forward with this 30 years above, if we don't have the really kind of regulation that have intention to help refugees, to go back for some is not an option, right? Many were born in the camp. Thank you so much, Kun Sally, for your sharing. Next. We will, actually, we plan to have another panelist to talk about their work in the camps. But as Kun Wannasingh is in the studio, we shift a little bit that we should have Kun Wannasingh talk about his experience on the refugees issue. So we will have a little bit has not a kind of presentation. We will come with the question and answer.
Okay.
Yeah. So thank you that you have time to come to this.
Thank you very much for having me. Also, they are seeing us now, right? Okay.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Through your documentary production, you have traveled around the world, particularly in the conflict zone. Please tell us why you are interested in the refugee issue.
Well, I've been traveling for 11 years now, so I've been lately, the past few years, I've been focusing a little bit more on the environmental issues. But before that, for a few years, I was focusing entirely on conflict zone and refugees and war zone. The reason it started off just as something I'm curious in, like what is war and how does it look like? We in Thailand, we heard about war as a piece of news, but never get to feel it or understand it much. And the starting point for me was in Rwanda. I got to travel there I wasn't interested in war that much before that, but in Rwanda I went to the monument regarding the genocide between the two tribes, the Hutu and the Tutsi there. And if you know the situation back then, it was basically 1 million people came out and killed another 400,000 people on the streets and bodies everywhere just because they are from different tribes. So it got me questioning, like, what is this? What is this about humanity? And are we all like that? So after that, I kind of trained myself in the art of documentary and starting to focus all my journeys on the more gray areas and conflict zone and war zone and places like that. But my show, it doesn't focus entirely on conflict zone. Sometimes we went to like the drug trade in Colombia or the Yakuza in Japan or stuff like that. But mostly something you wouldn't want to go yourself. Yeah, and naturally, after you became interested in wars, then you get to see the refugees who are the most affected by the war and conflicts. And then you want to do something about it. And at first, I got into contact with UNHCR first. So I worked with them for a lot of projects. And then other networks and organizations who are doing this kind of job already kind of contact me, and I get to get involved with a lot of people who are working very seriously on these issues, including like one of your partners, Umati. I work with them a lot. And last time we tried to get into Syria together, but couldn't got past the border between Turkey and Syria. But that was like a few years back. Right now I'm focusing a bit more on the climate change issues on my work, and probably come back full circle and doing issues about climate refugee in the future, because that's a new thing and it's coming in a few years. Yeah.
Yeah, that one is very interesting from your careers, and then you further move to the direction of interested in the refugee issue, right? And how those places that you have been visit, right? How does it look like? Because you also kind of visit Thai camps also.
Yes.
And how those places similar or different from these Thai camps?
I have seen a lot of living conditions, like what Kun Sally said. There are many situations regarding refugees, but I have a bit of experience with some of them. I would say that camps in Thailand looks more like a village compared to other camps I've been to. But as two of them mentioned, it's all on the temporary basis. So they have been here for many decades now, but still have to build house based on wood materials. And But it feels a lot safer compared to other camps I've been to, like in Afghanistan. There wasn't, when I went into the camps in Afghanistan, there were UN logo on the front, but inside there weren't any officials around at all, just the refugees themselves. And there are internally displaced people, so meaning coming from other provinces in Afghanistan. Afghanistan has been the world champion in the production of refugees for many decades now. Most of the refugees come from there, but in recent years, Syria and Myanmar has kind of climbed the ladder and become more. The numbers come more from Syria and Myanmar now. But anyway, the organization in Afghanistan didn't look that good when I was there. And compared to in Turkey, the Syrian refugee in Turkey, they got looked after quite a bit. There was even a system that allow the children in Syria to go to Turkish schools. By switching the time, they have to go to school. Like the Turkish children, they would go to school quite early in the morning, so they can have more time for the Syrian.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to actually it should be the webinar and it's live, but today it has a kind of the problem, so we make a record. We have with us here 3 guests. The first one, Themba, the Secretary General of Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network. Kun Sali, the Executive Director of the Border Consortium. And Kun Wannasingh, many of you know him already, the documentary production. So today we will come as a very easy going. We will have certain questions that ask them about why they are interested in the refugee issue. So each of them will base on their experience, their work, and they will share with us. So let's start. Who would like to start first?
You mean the reason we got involved?
Yes, sure.
Okay, so yeah, I might start. Hello, สวัสดีครับ สิงห์นะครับ I'm both the guest and might be a little bit of a co-host today as well because I have a lot of questions for you guys.
Sure.
Yeah, I have a bit of experience traveling around, interviewing refugees and talking to a lot of them and seeing their situation in many cases around the world. But the reason I got started is because I was curious about conflicts and war and try to learn about it firsthand by going to these places like Somalia, Afghanistan, North Korea, and Rwanda, places like that. After you got involved in conflicts, then it's quite inevitable that you will see refugees, and after you see them, then you would want to help them out in some certain ways. But before you can help them out, you must learn about them. So I would say that I got started because of direct experience in traveling. I wasn't intend to study that much about refugees and wars, but ended up touching my heart and emotions a lot this issue, and then has been doing a little bit of work on this issue ever since for a few years now.
Well, that is kind of not so intention, but after that you cannot leave it. You will continue with it, right?
Yeah.
So maybe you can tell us about why you are interested in the refugee issue, maybe from the global perspective.
Sure. Well, I initially wanted to make documentaries. And I went to Rwanda in 1996. It was about 14 months after the genocide. I mean, the genocide was still happening. It had just shifted into Zaire. And the Rwandan government shut the refugee camps that were across the border in Zaire. And 800,000 people came back to Rwanda in about 24 hours. And I realized in that moment that day, that shift of population was going to affect the geopolitical dynamics of that region for as long as I was alive. And I also realized that the challenges that those refugees were going to face coming back, being accused of committing genocide, having to live with neighbors that they had attempted to kill, having their entire lives shattered through this whole process on both sides, and the ongoing conflict were really, really fundamental to a lot of the core human values that we have, and question my role as someone external, and the role of all of us in the globe when it comes to displacement. But I didn't want to study it because I thought, well, the refugees are just the Band-Aid fix at the end of the problem. The real issue is the conflict itself, and that's what we should be looking at. But I had this realization that so often conflict is based in refugee movements and perceptions of who belongs where, and who is in what state, and these structures that suggest, going back thousands of years, that these people aren't like us. And so I thought that ensuring that we solve the problems that are facing refugees will also help us as a global community to bring greater peace to all of us. So that got me interested in it. And I got interested in it not in terms of how to provide food and blankets, but how to start a movement of rights, a civil rights movement for refugees, recognizing that they are people with rights. And if your state is the tool through which you access rights, what happens to a refugee? You don't have a state anymore. Who do you appeal to for rights? The UN can't provide you rights. So I started thinking about whether or not universal human rights are actually universal, or whether or not we actually consider refugees humans. And that got me thinking a lot. And here I am, a decade and a half later, still working on these problems.
Yeah, so it's kind of you never dream for, it's something like that.
Yeah.
But if you dream, you have to continue to dream on that.
Yeah.
And because in the refugee issue, so a lot talk about that it's a kind of refugee convention. On that one, how did you think that this one can benefit to the refugees?
Well, there's one major problem with the Refugee Convention. I think the Refugee Convention is really an unbelievable tool, and if we tried to make it again now, we wouldn't. The only reason the Refugee Convention exists is that there was such sympathy for refugees after World War II. The Allied powers had won, and they had this gathering. They came together. The first thing that happened was the establishment of the State of Israel. The second thing that happened was the decision to draft a convention around refugees and to solve the refugee problem in Europe. So that document represents a lot of rights for refugees, and it's the only tool that we have. So I think it's a really important document. But it has a lot of limitations. As we were talking about earlier, IDPs, people who are displaced by climate change, they don't fall into the concept of persecution under that particular convention. I don't advocate for opening up the convention, but I do advocate for creating structures that broaden it, that expand the definitions that we use and expand access to protection beyond the fairly narrow and constricted clauses in the Refugee Convention. What I think needs to happen with the convention is I do believe that states should at least model their domestic laws off of the convention, if not sign the convention. All of us who've worked with refugees here know that the essential problem is the lack of a legal sense of being. Access to education, access to work, access to freedom of movement. These are all fundamentally rooted in the recognition of the fact that you're human and that you can be represented before the law as a human to access your rights. So without the convention, you have no access to rights. You no longer become human under law. So I do appreciate the convention. It is an older document, but I am very hesitant about discussions about reopening it because I don't think that we have the global sympathy now for refugees that we did in the aftermath of World War II.
Yeah, so this is a kind of the global sympathy. Sometimes it's much more important than something that is just written in the paper, which is just put it there and never put into practice. With this, in the convention, so the definition of refugees, you can be a refugee when you have to cross the border. You cannot go back. And then when you go to somewhere, that country don't kind of welcome you and put you kind of okay, you can be our citizen, but they have a camp. Many places around the world, they have this kind of setting up the camp. And what is your perspective on this, about the camp refugees? How this one can ensure the rights of the people, particularly ensure how to protect them. In Thailand also we have the 9 camps. We call the temporary shelter, but it's already 30 years, over 30 years. Many people, many children were born there. How do you think about this situation? The camp can be the solution for that? Or how should we do with this?
Camps will never be the solution. People need their freedom. People need their freedom to choose what they will do. Camps create dependency. And that is something, when you look at the global refugee situation, where we have millions of refugees, we cannot afford to have millions, creating a situation where millions are dependent for their daily lives. Therefore, it's essential that really people need to take care to be allowed to be responsible for themselves. You have to give them the means, wherever they are, to take responsibility. There's a tendency to look at refugees and see them as just as victims. Refugees, they're like you and me. They've got a vast range of experience. They've got a vast range of skills. People don't come into a country because they want to be given something. Wherever they go, they want to contribute. And you have to look at what skill sets refugees bring and work with that. You've got to allow people to work. Otherwise, if you put them in a camp, they will dependent on you. And no government can support communities indefinitely. And no communities should be living in a bubble. They need to be part of the society that they have moved into, not kept separate from it. So I think for camps, perhaps at that very emergency initial phase, when you need to have a sense of who people are, where they come from, what their situation is, there is a time perhaps when you have a large influx to be able to manage that emergency with those people. That's another thing. The refugees themselves, they will organize amongst themselves. They know their own communities, and it's about giving them the resources to take care of themselves and their communities. And that's what we have to be, in the way that we manage the resources, humanitarian assistance, to ensure that it's actually going to refugees to be utilized in the ways that they want to do it, not in the way that we think that they should be managed.
So more or less, the kind of, we have to see them as a human, not dehumanize them, right? So as Wannasingh already traveled through over the globe, let's see, and faced many situations in that. And do you have any kind of the direct experience that you face really the situation that you talk with a refugee and you have a kind of exchange the experience with them, and what inspired you with, on that?
Well, to expand a little bit on what everybody else said, camps are one situation that refugees can find themselves in, but then you can find refugees in other situations as well, like urban refugee who kind of take refuge by themselves and stay illegally in a lot of places. I would say it's no better than camps. Maybe it's worse sometimes, because in camps you have a certain level of security, but on the other aspect, it's a limbo as well in terms of legal status. There's nothing to ensure that you exist anywhere, and you cannot work, you cannot provide for yourself. So I think that's one of the biggest suffering a human being can have, not to have any meaning or purpose in their life. And there are other situations like refugees who kind of build their own informal settlement and stick together. It's like a camp or a village, but not run by any state player or by any organization, just kind of people gathering together, like refugees from Syria go across the border and set up like a camp or village by themselves, informally. So I've seen a lot of different situations regarding refugees, but in different countries, there are different levels of management that I've seen. In Thailand, normally when I talk about this issue for Thai people, because my main audience are Thais, right? They see it as something that's very apart from our society, quite a bit far away, and don't know how to connect with this issue. But when I tell them that, do you know actually there's almost 100,000 refugees in Thailand? They're like, wow, really? And then I tell them that the refugees come from the longest civil war in the world, so that get their attention. The war I'm mentioning is that the war between the current and Myanmar government that's been going on for many decades now. The situation in camps in Thailand is it's more like a village, because they've been here for so many decades now. But at the same time, they cannot live legally. They cannot find jobs for themselves. Maybe they can work something inside the village. I'm not so sure. But there's a certain sense of security in there. There's no sense that some bomb's going to go off, a lot of crimes in there. So you say that they have a life that are deprived of purpose, but at the same time, they can ensure that they will survive physically in the camps just like that, which is run by state player in Thailand. And it's been throughout a lot of governments over the years. But then I have been to other camps, both for IDPs and for international refugees in the Middle East or in Eastern Africa. Like in Afghanistan, in Kabul, when I walk inside the camp, I just show up informally with another journalist. And we just walk in and there's no official there at all. There's a UN logo in front, but no one is taking care of it. And we went inside, and all the refugees who take refuge from other places inside Afghanistan, they came to talk to us. We tried to interview them a bit about the life in refugee camp, but they got very angry about the situation there, understandably. So a lot of anger, a lot of little to no management on that part. And I went to Somalia, which is a land that's, before this, has been living with our government for 20 years plus. And even now, there are multiple governments within the same nation, Somalia. And it's very chaotic there. No one is taking responsible for any particular situation that much. And in Mogadishu, the capital of Somalia, you can find, you can find trucks with guns and machine guns all around the place. And there were like 20 or 30 uniforms I can see within one city. So it means that there's a lot of warlords and a lot of armed forces existing within the same area, trying to compete for territories. And so what I'm saying that at least in Thailand we have a clear authority of who's taking care of it. The situation of the refugees is not ideal for sure, but when you ended up in some place that has some clear authority and responsibility, your life is a bit better compared to those without any clear management and organization at all. And I can tell that with my experience walking inside the areas of these camps.
This is very interesting direct experience and that you can have from the refugee there.
Yeah.
And of course, camp is not the destination. It's the kind of positive thing
to
have this one.
And I have one more thing to add. Even in Bangkok, I talked to some urban refugees who cannot go out of their apartments. They're from Syria and they cannot leave their apartments for many years now. They can go out for a few hundred meters to go buy some stuff to eat, but they cannot go out anywhere because there's no legal status for them in Thailand and they can get arrested anytime. So yeah, you have choice between have to live like an illegal immigrant or have to be confined in a very specific area along the borders. So there's no good choice.
Yeah. It's never been a kind of a choice in there. Right? And it's like, I heard from many says that refugee is not a choice.
Yeah.
Right? On that. And as you, maybe you have kind of heard about the host community. Normally, I'm not sure that along the night camp that how the host community think about that, or even in the place that you have experienced or the place that you've been visit. So how this, I mean, one way that to have, to see the refugee as a friend, as someone that we can support. But it's not everyone, not every country that is refugee friendly. How to advocate for these people, Thai people or any people that they kind of, oh, who's refugee? Why you come here? So you take the work from us. You are a high burden. How to raise awareness to the local community, to have a kind of perception to accept refugee as a human and as someone that not a burden, but a kind of those who has capacity to help maybe the economic, social, the welfare of the country, just to increase this one. Who would like to give this?
Perhaps I can say something about the host communities here in Thailand. Because I think there is a striking difference between, say, the policy that is set at a central level and actually the reality on the ground and the relationships between host communities and refugees. Generally, people in border areas, particularly, say, here in Thailand, they've been trading with each other for centuries. I mean, they also bear very similar ethnic backgrounds, whether they're Thai Karen, whether they're from Burma, the Thai Mon, the Mon in Burma, etc., the Shan, Thai Shan. So there's a lot of similarities. People have been working together. People are related on both sides. So in terms of the host communities in the border areas, I think they have been the refugees' first area for protection. When new arrivals came here into Thailand from Myanmar, they set up, they made connections with local communities. They set up very small encampments, all spread out over a very long area, and there was understanding. Where the difficulty is at a central level. And they tend, at a central level, to be seen as refugees whenever there are issues, as we were talking earlier, concern about deforestation, drugs, human trafficking. It's always seen as it's coming from the refugees. Whereas actually, if you look at the situation on the ground, when you look at, say, deforestation, where is it happening? It's big business that's able to clear land on a massive scale. Refugees may be being employed to work in these areas, but they're certainly not leading this. And I think that at that local level, the relationships in Thailand have been and continue to be very strong. And I guess it's also because people understand who they are. And whereas from a Bangkok level, there's a lot of fear about the border. They always say to me, oh, is it safe? Should I go? Because people have heard of the ongoing conflict. So therefore there is a concern that it's not safe in the border areas. And I think a lot is about people learning more about the actual context, about where refugees came from, what did they face. I came out here as a volunteer teacher. I ended up with a Karen community in Myanmar at the time when there was, they were in conflict with the Burma army. There was a student camp of students who had fled the 88 democracy uprising. And every weekend I was teaching political science with the students there. So I was learning about the democracy, the fight for democracy, the democracy struggle, and at the same time living with the ethnic people, I was learning about the struggle for self-determination. And it was through that I think, that's how I got started, say, in refugees. But it's about understanding what those people have been through, where they've come from. It's not just about creating a policy that's going to fit globally. There will be no one policy fits all. What's happening for refugees in Africa, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, is very different to some of the refugee situations here in Southeast Asia. And we have to look when anyone who gets involved, anyone here who's thinking of becoming involved in refugees, is look, listen, observe, understand the context of who these people are, where they've come from. And it's only through that that you can really start to respond to what their needs are, what they want to do, and not try and impose some global order onto refugees.
Right.
May I follow that up
Yeah,
with a little bit? I think you're spot on with that. And I think that one of the things that's core to remember here is that prejudice and intolerance are taught. They're not inherent to human beings. They're taught. And the idea that we should fear someone is not an idea that children have. It's an idea that we're taught over time. And I think that that has been able to grow for one specific reason, and that is that the people that we're talking about are never part of the conversation. We don't hear from them. We see images of them. If we do hear from them, it's the horror that they have been through that we're hearing. Now we've seen a little bit more of a positive take on that. COVID in Australia, there was a big effort put together by refugees to highlight refugee contributions to the medical institutions that were saving lives. Host communities, if we talk about host communities, what's being covered is often conflict with host communities. But only in the last month we saw in Aceh, the Indonesian government identified a boat of Rohingya refugees off the coast and ordered the boat to remain in place. And the villagers came out to the beach and they took over the beach and pulled the boat to shore and said, we need to help these people. And that kind of response is really a human response. And I think that when you look at refugees, when you do understand that core issue, what they've been through, that's what you come to. And that, we were talking about this earlier with documentaries and how you can't engage these populations and not realize that all that you've heard about them doesn't really apply. That they're not bringing with them terror and war. They're not bringing with them prejudice and intolerance and cultural practices that are offensive and uncleanliness and all of these things that we hear. That we could all be refugees. And there isn't a continent on the globe that hasn't experienced a refugee exodus except Antarctica. So, you know, this could happen to all of us, and I think we really need to have that fundamental understanding. And the host communities know it. And the host communities know it because they're the ones that have those historical ties with the people who are coming across the border. They're the ones that meet them and feed them and house them. It's those of us in places like Bangkok who don't have that direct engagement, who are able to learn that we should fear them or that they're going to take our jobs or they're going to, you know, undermine our values. Our values should be compassion and welcoming. And so, I mean, I would say that fundamentally it's that engagement with the populations themselves that can really change that perception.
Wannasingh look curious. Do you have any question to ask our speaker also?
I just have some more experience to share, but it's not really directly answering the question. But just a case like to kind of expand on the point that for every place is so different. You cannot just take refugee as a one issue and then imply all the interpretation on everything. And the discrimination and fear can happen on a massive scale. Like when you look at something who looks very different from you coming into your country, then you might have some persuasion about it. Like maybe the refugee from Eastern Africa or in a lot of conflict zone in Africa going to Europe, and there's a lot of problems happening, right? But even for subtle difference, like I spent a few weeks interviewing North Korean defectors who came into South Korea and tried to work there. It's very hard for them to get a job there, even though they speak the same language. They look the same, but the subtle difference still leads to a lot of discrimination as well. They started off as one nation, as you might know, right? But I just learned from that trip that a lot of the words in South Korean got dubbed in English, like orange juice is Jesuit in South Korean, but in North Korean it's the original word for orange juice. So I talked to a North Korean man who said that he couldn't read anything in Seoul at all, even though it's the same language, because they use so much different words. And he tried to get a job in Seoul, but a lot of culture different as well. Like when going to the meeting, North Korean would kind of go straight to the point, and sometimes counteract and kind of talk something directly to the superior officers. But which is quite surprising for me as well. I thought North Korea would never do that, given their political structure. But on the other hand, South Koreans kind of walk around the bush, trying to get to the point and not try to talk directly. And so they perceive their culture quite differently as well. So what I'm getting to is that discrimination and stereotype is very pervasive throughout every society, whether you have refugees or not anyway. So we have capacity to be emphatic, and absolutely hate and discrimination is taught. But on the other hand, we kind of have this natural tendency to divide ourselves into groups. And you can see it everywhere, even though you look entirely the same, you speak the same language. And even in Thailand, right now, we see in the political climate that we are trying to divide ourselves into groups, which doesn't exist 12 years ago or 15 years ago. So that makes something like accepting the refugees community by the host communities sometimes quite difficult if the issue is exaggerated by the media or by influx of social media comments, whatever. And one incident might happen and it might be blown out of proportion and exploded into a massive wave of hatred for a certain group of people as well. And it doesn't have to come from refugee situation. You're seeing it now in USA right now. And so, yeah, I think it's going to be more widespread issues in the future regarding hatred and discrimination.
Actually, you touched a point that I really want to ask about the social media, because as yourself, everyone go to the social media, right?
Yeah.
And as yourself, as a documentary producer, you've been working a lot with this social media. How the social media can help, can make people understand, or can ease the hatred or prevent the hatred.
You can go to the common trait that we all have, which is our humanity. So it would be great. On one hand, social media is very divisive and making us argue to the point of death on very meaningless issues, like whether you should do this, dress like this, or pull your hair like that. But a lot of hate speech online, as you might know already, right? But on the other hand, it's a platform for somebody who can use this wisely to showcase the humanity of their own groups, and find a common ground that they can communicate between us and them, and doesn't make the difference between us become more exaggerated than it has to be. For example, I'm following Twitter account of a Saudi woman who took refuge from her country a few years ago, and every day she's doing political statement by just doing new hairstyle, dressing nicely, and showing off her freedom, and it makes us more relatable to her as a human being, something like that. And that's something I think if our refugee community learns how to do well, it might create more accepting perspective from the host community, and it can go a long way if it become a new consciousness of society. It can bring resources, can bring help or whatever. Some community is lacking on this part. I never seen a lot of any Rohingya person on social media that much, but if they have opportunities to communicate well through social media, we might learn about their perspective from inside the camps, from their daily lives as well. Me, myself, would be very interested in that. So if they learn how to do that, then they doesn't need any agency like us, doesn't need any documentary maker like me to promote their own values and their humanity. They can do it themselves.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
sorry, I think there's one other thing about social media. I mean, maybe you were going to ask about social media again, but I think there's one invisible side here that's really, really also important when we talk about refugees. And that is that when you're uprooted from the place that you call home, and you're stripped of all of the tools and supports that you have, and you're forced into exile, many times you're doing that alone. Sometimes you're doing that with a few family members or people that you meet on the way. And you no longer have the really very fundamental and critical supports of your community. Social media, what I've seen of it in terms of the way that refugees use it, is a portable community. When you are resettled to Canada, you still have your community back in Kakuma or Dadaab or Zaatari or up in the border area. You still have those supports. When you travel with your friends and you get separated and one of you goes to detention and one of you takes a boat and one of you still have that community and you maintain that support. So I think social media acts as a protective mechanism for emotional and psychological risk with refugees. The flip side, of course, as you've touched on, is that it can be very, very divisive. And if we look at the role of social media in Myanmar, for example, there's very little discussion that you could put forward that suggests that social media didn't help to drive what's happened in Myanmar. So I'm hesitant to compliment the role of social media when it comes to refugees, but I do think that that one core element of it, creating a mobile community that can advise each other, that can provide information to each other, that can support each other, is really fundamental to think about with refugees.
Yeah, so that is very kind of in-depth experience that you have. So before we end this session, I would like to have one question, kind of burning question on that. And let's see that let's just go back to the camp refugee again. In your experience or in your thought, what do you think is the exit for this situation, the camp refugee situation? Yeah. What is an exit and what should be a future direction on this? Who want to come first?
I think Sally should have a lot of information regarding this. Yeah.
I think, again, the key exit is to give people freedom of movement, and that's about documentation. So it's about verifying their nationality, it's about getting them citizenship, and it's getting them documentation, so that those who want to return back to Myanmar, they've then got documentation so that they can move within the country to where they want to live, where there's work, where there's which you have to have. If you need to get land when you go back, you need to have documentation. If they want to remain here in Thailand, if there isn't the livelihoods opportunities in Myanmar, if they've got citizenship, they can come back into Thailand as legal Myanmar citizens to work legally in Thailand. Too many of the refugees go informally into the migrant communities, therefore they are illegal and they are open to exploitation. So for me, it comes down primarily to documentation, so that then refugees are able to move, to make choices as to what they want to do and not be told, you will go and live there, you will do that, or you will work there. With documentation, they have more then of a tool of their own means to decide where they go.
Well, to answer that question is that I can answer, I have no idea. And yeah, so I will base my answer on earthquake answer. But I think before that kind of legal process that needed can happen, there would have to be a lot of public sympathy as well, because we have so many issues in Thailand or around the world. And right now it's about COVID-19 mostly, 90% about COVID-19. So if we raise any issues about refugees right now, they'll say, oh, wait, we have to do something first. Like been waiting about climate change for 50 years now, and nobody's done anything about that. So our role as a media person would have to be trying to create something of public sympathy like that, and to suggest to the public like what needs to be done to make this kind of process happen, because it's not going to happen by itself, especially with the current government. I don't think that's going to pay a lot of attention to this kind of issues, and so the public need to cry out a little bit. But before that can happen, other issues in society that regard the domestic population has to be addressed first. Otherwise, nobody's going to pay enough attention to this kind of situation that much. What do you think? Yeah.
I echo both of those comments, and I think that I would just say it's an imperfect tool, but the tool already exists, and that is the international refugee law. And under international refugee law, indefinite encampment is not a solution. Camps were never part of the initial response to refugees. They're newer than that. What the solutions put forward by international refugee law are return, which in most cases is not an option. You wouldn't be a refugee if it was. Integration and resettlement. And we know that resettlement is something that the numbers are very, very small. The opportunities are not very present. So the only real solution tends to be integration. And what we see with camps is an attempt to make that not happen. But people do integrate, and there are pathways there. And as part of that process, under international refugee law, you should facilitate access to naturalization, access to citizenship. That's in the convention. And that pathway is the only one that nobody's ever really explored. People have tried to push people back to their countries. People have tried to do resettlement. But really looking at the integration option, there aren't really good examples of that around the world. And where they have successfully done integration, they haven't really pushed that far into the idea of naturalization and citizenship. And the hesitancy there is that you have to realize that these people aren't going home anytime soon. But that's the reality. So I would say, one pathway forward out of the camp experience is to look at the tools we already have. We don't have to invent anything new. It's not coming up with some new plan. The plan is there. We just have to actually do it.
So, any of you want to mention anything? No? No more? Kun Wannasingh, you want to mention anything?
Oh.
Yeah, so
Okay.
it's time already.
I would, I don't know if it's conclusion or not, but I would say this issue has been a long-standing issue with the global population for so many decades now. So, I'm doing a lot of work in climate change as well. So, like climate change, when it's a global issue, then nobody really has to take responsibility that much. When it's a long-standing issue, then there's no time frame to limit, like when it needs to be fixed, when somebody has to do anything about it, what government has to take responsibility about it. So what I'm saying that it's not only the issue itself, but the nature of the problem makes it quite difficult to address in terms of gathering political will, in terms of trying to push any agenda forward. So as a documentary maker, I can explore all the issues and communicate to the society. But if I was a politician, I would be kind of dumbfounded, like where do I start, how do I get the support, how do I get the people to kind of, even though I'm well-meaning in this kind of issue, but to push this kind of international agenda forward while you are having a lot of domestic problems, that's going to be a lot of challenge. So yeah, so we need something who's really serious about this to make anything, I'm talking about in Thailand, to push forward anything else in the future. Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you so much for all of your experience and your in-depth thought about the issue of the refugees. And actually, we have to end today, and now because it's kind of over the time already. Thank you so much, Kun Sally, Kun Wannasingh, and Kun Themba Lewis. So next time we will talk about the Rohingyas refugee in Thailand, and we might not have faced any technical problem again. See you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ka.